All right, gentlemen, welcome to your next ethics lecture. This one is focusing on the ethics of just war and waging peace. Probably, I don't know, 95% of the information that you're going to see in this PowerPoint comes from the chapter readings, so it's very heavily based on the book. So if there's something that I comment on or mention that you missed in your process of taking notes, obviously you can pause it and go back to it, or you can dig into the textbook as you read through chapter 7 and see what it is in there that you need to get. Again, quite a list of words here. We'll go through this in a kind of sequential manner, so hopefully this will all make sense to you as we go. So what are our objectives for this particular presentation? One, we want to describe the scriptural roots of both war and peace. We'll do that kind of quickly, looking both at the Old and the New Testament. We're going to spend most of our time is looking at the historical evolution of the just war theory and who the various theologians were that contribute to its development. Many of the names that we're going to mention in that part of the lecture we've already seen earlier this semester when we had the lecture that was the kind of historical overview to Christian ethics. We want to look at the modern church and some documents that set forth the current use of the just war theory. Again, this is something that's been around for quite a long time, but it's undergone some pretty major renovations over the course of the years. And then finally look at some ways to describe criteria for just war as well as how to wage peace, which sounds like a strange phrase, but we'll talk about that later in the PowerPoint as well. You could disregard here the point about Martin Luther King on the bottom there. We're not going to do that in this online lecture. So the biblical roots of peace and war, again, if we begin with the Hebrew scriptures, if we think back, again, you guys studied the Old Testament as freshmen, you've seen pieces of it in sophomore and junior year religion. Every period of the Israelite history, from Exodus to Babylon, even to the time of Jesus, that was full of a lot of conflict and injustice. At times the people were enslaved, at times they were in exile, at times they were oppressed by some foreign power. And they always cried out to God in these moments of need, and God was thought to be this kind of warrior God who would come in and fight for his people. Whether it was the period of the judges or calling Moses at the burning bush to confront Pharaoh to set the people go, or whether it was while in exile in Babylon praying that a Messiah will come, to redeem God's lost people. Even up to the time of Jesus, one of the challenges of the reason the people didn't accept Jesus was because he didn't fit kind of their expectations of who the Messiah was going to be. They thought the Messiah would be a great warrior leader like King Saul or somebody like David or maybe one of the great prophets like Elijah. And instead they get Jesus, who's a carpenter from Nazareth, from the northern region of Galilee. In any event, the expectations were that God would continue to be kind of a warrior God, much like other civilizations, to fight on the side of his people. But even though we see this theme very prevalent in the Old Testament, there's also a great theme of peace that we find in the Old Testament as well. There's this expectation that if people just stayed faithful and true to God's commandments, if they stay true to the covenant, they will experience great peace and prosperity. Life will be good for them. Um, and the textbook even makes the point, which I think is very important, that the people cannot experience peace apart from obedience and faith to God. Here's a quick little quote here. It says, in these biblical passages, true peace always involves a reciprocal or two-way relationship between God and man. God desires humanity to live in peace and is more than willing to grant it, but people cannot experience this peace apart from faith and belief in God. This reciprocal understanding of peace can be found in various places, like the book of the prophet Isaiah. Here's a quick example. A strong city have we, he sets up walls and ramparts to protect us. Open the gates to let in the nation that is just, one who keeps the faith. And another example from Isaiah, justice will bring about peace, right will produce calm and security. So again, a sense of peacefulness with obedience and faith very much linked together. When we get to the New Testament, obviously Jesus says things like, blessed are the peacemakers as a part of the Sermon on the Mount, for they will be called children of God. But this whole idea of peace that we find in the Bible it comes from the Hebrew word shalom. And sometimes we think about shalom as just being peace, meaning no conflict. There's not violence between me and someone else. But really the sentiment of shalom is very much a wish of total well-being for the other person. There's no animosity, there's no contempt in one's heart for the other. It's very reminiscent of that term namaste that we saw last semester in world religions. And so when Jesus gives this command of being a peacemaker, somebody who works for shalom, for the total well-being of the other person, this is really part and parcel of loving one's neighbor as oneself, that very much that's a part of what's expected of his followers. Another passage we find in the Sermon on the Mount is that famous, if someone strikes you on the one cheek, turn it off for the other one as well. And this is really Jesus being countercultural here. This is one of those passages that I think is often misinterpreted in the Bible. People see it as, well, Jesus is telling me to be a doormat and just let people who are aggressive towards me walk all over me. But he says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn it off for the other one as well. If you just touch your right cheek for a moment and think, if somebody is standing in front of me and is going to hit me on my right cheek, the way they're going to do this is going to be either hitting me with my left hand or their left hand, or, which again, in that case, probably people wouldn't do. Most people would have been right-handed as they are today. Or to strike me on the right cheek, they'd be giving me the back of their right hand, which is a dismissive slap. It's the kind of hit in Jesus' day a master would have given a slave or a parent to a child. And instead, Jesus is saying, no, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn it off for the other one as well. It's a way of using kind of a wry sense of humor and standing up for yourself and saying, look, if you're going to strike me, you're going to treat me as an equal. You're going to treat me as someone who has dignity. So this is a great example, again, of continuing in this text to be an admonishment to not just defend one's friends, to be a doormat in a sense and let evil things happen to another, but be willing to stand up. That again, working and promoting justice or building a community of justice does involve work, and it does involve risk, and it does involve at times having to stand up and perhaps experience, a little violence in order to achieve a peaceful and ethical goal. All right, so what about the historical development of the just war theory? If we're going to go back to some of the major thinkers, the first person we have to hit on is St. Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose was a mentor to Augustine. You're going to see Augustine momentarily on the slide. Was a very important figure in the early church in the first couple of hundred years. And what did he have to say, you might say, about just war? Well, or about the use of war. He says, war is justified if it's used to defend the weak or the oppressed. Generally it's not something you just go out and say, well, we're going to have a war and we want to conquer some people. There has to be a purpose or a reason. Again, Ambrose teaching that war can be justified if its purpose is to defend the weak and oppressed. Ambrose, who was heavily influenced by the Roman philosopher Cicero, also held that war must be legally declared by a legitimate authority, those who have the authority or the respect of the masses, if you will, in the position of authority. And innocent people must never be killed or targeted, and that the defeated party must always be treated with justice following the cessation of hostilities. So you don't target innocent civilians as much as possible, and obviously afterwards we're going to treat the conquered people in a sense of fairness. So these are the earliest seeds. He's the first Christian thinker to contribute or develop this idea. Augustine of Hippo, one of the great doctors of the church, takes it a step further. He's going to build upon Ambrose's ideas and recognize that any society must work to establish and maintain, here's the key phrase, tranquillitas ordinis. I'm hoping I said that right. I am not a Latin scholar. Tranquillitas ordinis, which means peace and order. Augustine's going to argue that the goal of any society is to establish and maintain peace and order. And that sometimes in order to achieve that sense of peace and order, war must be engaged, that one must engage in the use of violence, killing, in order to achieve ultimately that goal of peace and order. Augustine's going to argue that military force can be used for this purpose, but it was only in extraordinary circumstances out of necessity. Augustine taught that war can be declared by lawful authority, again, legitimate authority, and it can be waged only for a just cause. Examples of just cause included protecting the innocent from harm or avenging injury suffered at the hands of an aggressor. Injury for Augustine refers to a situation where one nation refuses to return property that it has unjustly taken from another, or when it refuses to rectify injustices perpetrated by its citizens. In cases such as these, the victimized nation has just cause to go to war, but in doing so, its motivation must be towards tranquillitas ordinis, about trying to get back to a stasis of peace and order. Augustine goes on to say that war should not be motivated by leaders who are bloodthirsty, vengeful, or cruel, that war is ultimately, again, about leading to peace, not to more violence and more war. Jump up to the 12th century. Again, our next big thinker, again, the next one in the series of ethical thinkers that we talked about earlier this semester is St. Thomas Aquinas. And he's going to identify 3 specific criteria for a just war to exist. And I've got some citations here that you can read more about this in the book on page 159. Again, war must be declared by a sovereign authority. We've seen this with Ambrose, we saw it with Augustine. 2, that there must be a just cause. One nation may wage war against another to right an injustice. We heard echoes of this beginning with Augustine a moment ago. 3rd, right intention. One nation, may wage war against another to repress evil and to promote the common good. Again, the common good is another way of saying, in a sense, tranquilitas ordinis, the sense of peace and order within a society. And that's pretty much the way this kind of theory went up until we get to the 20th century. We have a rather rotund here, Pope St. John the 23rd, known for calling Vatican Council II together. He's going to write a document called Christianity and Social Progress in 1961. If you think about what was going on in this kind of late 50s into the 60s eras on the global stage, if you will, there's great gap between wealthy nations and those who were trying to kind of develop themselves post World War II. And he kind of looks at the signs of the time of the world of the early 1960s, and Pope St. John Paul the 23rd is like, wait a minute, there's some issues here that can potentially be seeds of conflict within the world. So he speaks about gaps between the developed and underdeveloped nations. He warns that excessive imbalance in economic wealth will lead to injustice and warfare and conflict. Again, even think about more contemporary wars. How many wars are fought, not just for religious reasons, we certainly are well aware of those, but over economic reasons, because of wanting to control a certain resource or to control a certain piece of geography or land, because if you control that land, you control the trade, et cetera, et cetera. And the Pope says to maintain peace, nations must need to treat each other with justice, that human dignity must be respected, and there's a call to maintain global solidarity. Solidarity, again, from last year, you'll recall, is that sense of togetherness, the constant commitment to the common good. Very important quote here, I think, by St. Pope John the 23rd. He warns that, quote, when humanity separates itself from God, it becomes monstrous to itself. Very, very powerful kind of quote. Very much, I think, even lives in the world today. I think with our loss sometimes of faith within the public sphere, that's led us to kind of some pretty precarious ethical situations within the world today. Following John the 23rd, we have Pope Paul VI, who wrote on the development of peoples in 1967, also contributed by some others. He maintains the warnings of John the 23rd about economic injustice as a root cause of conflict in the world. He warns that international relationships must not be based on force, but on a spirit of solidarity and cooperation. And a quote, again, if we seek to form a genuine peace, we need to recognize a true respect for humanity. Again, it's all back to LDHP, back to that foundation principle of Catholic social teaching. U.S. bishops today, particularly in the 1980s, have come out with even more documents, and to the present day, there's a presumption in favor of peace. So if you will, that preferential option is for peace first, but still allow for the use of force in a justifiable situation. That we should do no harm to our neighbor, how we treat our enemy is a test of how we love our neighbor. Again, a very powerful, I think, quote there. How we treat our enemy is a test of how we love our neighbor. It's kind of another way of saying the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. How strong is our global community? Do we support and defend all links within that chain? And finally, taking even one life should be done with fear and trembling. Again, this great reverence for life, and that war should be a last resort when all other means have tried and failed. So what does the current form of the doctrine of just war explain? Again, I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly because, again, you're going to get a lot more detail in your reading of chapter 7. So there's 3 ways that it's applied. There's the question of whether or not it's just to go to war in the first place. Then there's a question of what about once you're in the war? Is there a way to engage in just warfare? And then what about as the war ends and you seek a way out of the conflict? Again, a lot of times people just focus on this first piece. We're going to actually look at, because the book presents it, all three aspects. So what about jus ad bellum, which is again just in going to war? 7 criteria. Again, I'm going to list here. You can pause it, copy it all down in your notes. And I have pages here where you can see where this information comes from. But there needs to be a just cause. Again, we heard that all the way back in the 3rd and 4th century with Ambrose, that the war would be considered just if we're confronting a real and certain danger. I think what we saw with the US involvement, for example, in World War II, clearly would be a just cause. Competent authority. Again, we've seen that from the very beginning. Those entrusted with protecting the common good, meaning that there's people in power, whether that's a king, whether that's a president, whether that's a Congress, whether that's a parliament. There are legitimate folks in charge politically who make that call, yes, our nation is going to war. Third, comparative justice asks how to evaluate the values, the goals hoped to achieve versus the human cost of war. If you think about it, we know if you're going into a war, people are going to die. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? That's the comparative justice piece. Is the underlying cause of why we're considering going to war and the human cost as well as the monetary cost, is it worth it? Also, I think very much we get into this mistaken notion. Again, I love our country, but the sense that God is always on our side. This criteria says that no nation involved in a just war can assume that God is absolutely on their side. Because we all have kind of biases a little bit if we're trying to figure out whether or not we're going to get into a particular armed conflict or not. Fourth, right intention. War only allowed to protect innocent life and human rights. Last resort, number 5. All other efforts for peace have been tried and failed. Things like negotiations and embargoes and sanctions, and sometimes circling back and trying more negotiations, etc. That there does need to be other avenues that one tries before going and declaring war. Probability of success. Nobody wants to go to war to lose. So the belief that the military will be successful and achieve what the goals are, the spelled out goals of the particular war or conflict. And again, proportionality. The cost of the war should be in proportion to the goals of the war. We're not going to make the war at a broader scope than what it needs to be in order to accomplish the particular goals that are being set out for in the conflict. So that's the question of whether or not it's just to go to war in the first place. Now we can look at the question of how to wage the war itself. So let's say, hypothetically, we have decided that the particular conflict that we are getting into does meet the criteria of a just war. Now that we are at war, how do we wage it? How do we do it in a way that's just and ethical? Again, proportionality comes back again. This idea of not exceeding what is necessary to achieve the goals of the war. So we don't, what's that? The old expression, kill a fly with a sledgehammer kind of thing. That we're using the appropriate amount of force to achieve the goals that we've set. The need to discriminate, and discrimination here is a good way in a sense that we're making sure that we try as best as we can to identify clearly who is and who is not a combatant involved in conflict. So we're not targeting innocent civilians in hospitals and places like that in the course of a military conflict. And then the third area is the jus post bellum, which is just after the war. How do we get out of the war in a way that's just and fair? And again, this is another piece that's often not talked about. 3 characteristics the book mentions here that need to be considered. Vindication of rights. Is it unfair for the victorious nation to realize, it is unfair, for the victorious nation to realize any gains beyond the establishment of the basic rights? We don't go to war to come out ahead. We go to war to get things back to, again, tranquilitas ordinis, the peace and order that was there before, or to right the injustice. Reconciliation. After the conflict is ended, all parties should repent. Again, all parties should recognize the evil and sinfulness that inevitably is a part of a violent conflict that's war. And restoration. The victorious nation has a duty to help the defeated nation to reestablish a functional society. Again, functional society doesn't mean we have to build up, the defeated nation better than they were before, but at least to come in and help rebuild, rebuild the infrastructure, bury the dead, make sure appropriate human resources are available for the folks who live in that area, so that you're not getting, an enemy who's going to come back in 10 years and want to seek revenge, but a sense that they're going to move on in their own direction in their own way now that the particular injustice has been dealt with. So just going to war, just in the war, and just in terms of trying to get out of the war and establishing peace afterwards. Speaking of peace, our last slide is going to take a look at how we wage peace. And again, part of this is outlined at the end of the chapter. In 1983, the U.S. bishops released a document called The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace. And they outlined 5 agendas for peacemaking. And again, I think the reason we wanted to share these with you is obviously because it's in the chapter, but you guys also, these should all be things that you remember from last year in the Catholic Social Teaching course, second semester. And if you see the blue line here at the end of the bullet, you're going to see these next cycle when either Mr. Gedeke or I are going to talk about globalization and debt and international business, if you will. So it's going to be something you're going to see again in the next cycle. So these are the 5 goals. Again, they're explained in the book, pages 182 to 185, so you can get them in more detail there. But international politics must be about solidarity and human rights for all. Again, solidarity is that spirit of togetherness, which we already mentioned. 2, all nations should promote a full complement of human rights. Again, that it's not just selective, but that we really are promoting, again, all human rights. You can go back to things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to get a sense of what those universal rights are and should be. 3, a greater need for sustained development in impoverished nations. Again, recognizing that much of the violent conflicts that exist in our world are the result of disparities between the haves and the have-nots. And whether that's between a powerful nation and a weaker nation, an economically influential nation and an economically poor nation, or whether that's within a nation, as you guys saw with Romero when you studied last year, between the 10% rich in a country and the 90% who are destitute and extraordinarily poor. 4th, restraint of nationalism and the elimination of ethnic and religious violence. Again, it's this idea of respecting other religions. Again, that's why we did the World Religions course last semester, was to get us all to have better basic literacy so we can respect and understand people whose religious views are different than our own. And 5th, work to strengthen international global security, in places where, whether it's terrorism or whether it's other forms of violence and inequality that are causing, crises in terms of human rights. If you look at these 5 things, these are not easy to do. That's why we call this a sense of waging peace, that we have to put effort into it if we're going to promote peace in a just and fair way in our global community today. Again, you guys are going to be reading through chapter 7. You get a lot more information on all of these areas. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll get back to you. Take care.